Okay, everyone. It is 12 o'clock, and I wanted to welcome everyone to Manat's second webinar in our small sit virtual series called Planting the Seed, Opportunities and Challenges for Oyster Reef Building in Maine, presented by Manat's Dr. Marissa McMahan, Senior Director of Fisheries, and Jessie Batchelder, Fisheries Project Manager. I'm Gina Rourke, Manat's Senior Director of Marketing and Communications. I'm going to be our MC today. And if you're new to Manamat, a little background on our organization. We use science and collaboration to reverse shorebird decline, promote coastal resiliency, and educate and inspire the next generation of conservationists across the Western Hemisphere. And if you're a friend, volunteer, trustee, or donor to Manamat already, then thank you. It is only with your support that we can continue to get our boots, and in this case, wetsuits, muddy, doing hands-on science in collaboration with local partners. And just a couple of housekeeping notes for today's webinar. We welcome your curiosity, so please type any questions you have into the Q&A box, and Jessie and Marissa are going to be happy to answer them at the end of the presentation as time allows. And if you can keep the chat session, which will be reserved for comments or any tech issues you might be having. And now, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Manat's Dr. Marissa McMahan, Senior Director of Fisheries, to introduce Jessie. The floor is yours, Marissa.
Great. Thank you so much, Jean, and thanks everyone for attending today. We're excited to have an opportunity to talk about some of our habitat restoration work that we've been doing in the Gulf of Maine. So I'm going to kick us off with sort of a high-level overview and then hand it off to Jessie Batchelder, who is our Fisheries Project Manager and has really been doing a lot of the sort of on-the-ground project management for this work. Jessie, do you want to share the presentation?
Is that coming through?
Yep, it's just not in slideshow. Yeah,
there we go.
Perfect. Awesome. So as Jean mentioned, one of the focus areas at Manat is coastal resilience and restoration. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about today. So I want to start by just giving an overview of the fisheries program at Manat. And Jessie, if you want to just advance one slide forward. Perfect. So our fisheries work is really focused on promoting resilient and productive coastal ecosystems and communities through applied science and community engagement. And our work focuses primarily on the Gulf of Maine, which is shown here on this map. It's a shallow sea spanning from Massachusetts to Nova Scotia. This is about 36,000 square miles of ocean, 7,500 miles of coastline. But unfortunately, this is also a body of water that's experiencing ocean warming faster than 99% of the rest of the world's oceans. So really unprecedented rates of ecological and social change. And Jessie, if you want to just go forward one slide. So at Manat, our work is really focused on mitigating and adapting to this change through diversifying fisheries resources, so fishers are more resilient to climate change impacts, strengthening those fisheries resources and restoring critical habitats, monitoring long-term climate change impacts, and supporting adaptive fisheries management at the local, state, and federal level. And so these are just some snapshots here of some of the species and habitats that we're focused on, spanning shellfish, river herring, invasive species like green crabs, emerging species that are moving north as the waters warm, such as black sea bass and blue crabs. We focus a lot of our effort on mudflat habitat, rocky intertidal habitat, eelgrass, kelp beds, and of course, the focus of today, oyster reefs. So if you want to go forward one, Jessie. So this talk's really going to focus on shellfish. And as we are talking about shellfish in traditional Wabanaki homelands, we really wanted to start this talk by acknowledging that shellfish have been harvested and stewarded in what we now call Maine for thousands of years and are an integral part of Wabanaki sustenance fishing livelihoods and cultural identity. And this is an image of the whaleback shell midden in Damariscotta, Maine. And this is just a really incredible visual representation of how important shellfish have been and still are to the Wabanaki people. And so if you want to just go forward another slide, Jessie, I next want to just give sort of an overview, start with an overview of our fisheries work in Manomet, and now shift to thinking about oyster reefs and oyster reef restoration, and just giving a little bit of sort of background and intro for that. So oyster reefs are a critical habitat that occur in the intertidal and shallow subtidal throughout the world's oceans. And unfortunately, there's been about an 85% loss of this habitat over the past 2 centuries, due primarily to habitat degradation and overexploitation. And this is a really major concern because these reefs provide many ecosystem services. So things such as improving water quality, reducing coastal erosion, promoting biodiversity, as well as supporting commercial and recreational harvesting. And this photo is a great example of a reef that has been intentionally built in front of marsh habitat to protect that marsh habitat and reduce erosion. So if you want to just go forward one, Jessie. Perfect. So as I mentioned, oyster reefs occur all over the world, and this is a map showing what condition oyster reefs are in globally. So blue indicates good condition, yellow is fair, that reddish orange is poor, and then the darker red color is basically extinct. And so the real high-level takeaway here is that unfortunately there's very few blue areas on this map where reefs are in good condition. The other big takeaway, if you just advance one, Jessie, I think a little, yep, an arrow will pop up. So the other big takeaway from this is that there's a complete absence of oysters in the area that we're focused on, which is the Gulf of Maine. And so the reason why there's just a lack of any color here is because oysters have not naturally occurred in the Gulf of Maine in recent history. And that's just primarily because it's too cold for them to survive, or has historically been. However, as I mentioned before, the Gulf of Maine is now warming at an unprecedented rate and is actually becoming much more suitable for oysters. And so if you want to advance one more, perfect. So that leads us to this Basin Oyster Project that we're going to talk about today. And so I want to give a little bit of background on the project before handing it over to Jessie to get into the details. But I'm going to first start us with a couple more maps here just to orient to where we're working. So this first map is just a map of Maine, and that little red square that you can see is the general area where this project's taking place. So sort of the southern mid-coast Maine area. And then this next map is really zoomed in on the area that we are doing this restoration work in. And so this is an area called the Basin. It's what you would refer to as a hurricane hole. So it's this really sheltered embayment off of the New Meadows River in Phippsburg, Maine. And then those little red circles indicate where we're actually doing the reef building inside of this very sheltered body of water. And then the last thing I just want to point out here on this map, I don't know how it looks on everyone else's screen. It's a little bit dark to see, but the majority of the land that is surrounding this body of water is actually owned by the Nature Conservancy, which is the organization that actually initiated this project about 8 years ago. So Jessie, if you want to just advance one more. So it was 2017 when the Nature Conservancy embarked on this effort to build the first oyster reef in Maine in waters that were adjacent to their property in the basin. And they use structures that are sometimes called oyster castles. And so that's the middle photo that you're looking at. That's an oyster castle. And essentially, these are structures that are built so that oyster larvae will settle onto them, attach to the structure, and then grow. And the idea is if you put enough of these out, you've essentially laid a foundation for the reef to grow upon. However, this project ran into major issues with predation, and specifically predation from the invasive green crab. green crabs are voracious predators of shellfish. Here's actually a picture of a green crab on the far right here that's eating a soft shell clam. So these little oyster castles, unfortunately, were essentially an all-you-can-eat buffet for these crabs. The little small oysters that were settled on them really had, no defense against these crabs. So at the end of this project, TNC determined that this was likely not a viable form of restoration in Maine. And if you want to just advance one, Jessie. In 2020, TNC approached the town of Phippsburg, where they had been doing this work, and they, essentially were looking to see if the town had any interest in taking the project over. And it turned out that both the Conservation Committee in the town and the Shellfish Committee were really interested in continuing to pursue this idea of building an oyster reef in the basin, for all of those, wonderful ecosystem services that I mentioned before. And essentially the positive impacts that building a reef in this area could have. And so the town agreed to take over the project from the Nature Conservancy and continue to explore ways that reef building might be viable. And then soon after that, the town approached several additional partners, the Maine Oyster Company, Bates College, Manamat, and essentially built out a team of folks that were, really focused on trying to, again, figure out how to viably build an oyster reef in Maine, where it had never been done before. And so this team includes community partners, shellfish harvesters, wild shellfish harvesters, oyster farmers, scientists, academics, a whole host of people that bring different strengths and different experiences to the project. And it's really this sort of grassroots effort that brought everyone together to try to make this happen. And so with that, I am going to hand it over to Jessie to talk more about the actual details of what we're doing.
Thanks, Marissa. So I think we have a really good background on where the project came from and oyster reefs in general. So I'll dive into a little more of what we're doing now, what our project goals are, and kind of where we're thinking about going in the future with this. And so Marissa mentioned this briefly, and you could see on the map that historically we weren't seeing oyster reefs in this area of Maine where we are. But oyster reef restoration is a really well-established practice in a lot of other places along the coast. They just happen to be further south, and at least for now, in waters warmer than what we have in our area. So a big part of this is, can we do this in Maine? Is it viable in these waters? And what are the impacts in this ecological region if this is successful? And one of our biggest questions about this is, if we can build this reef, is it self-sustaining? We can put oysters out there year after year, but if there isn't any larval recruitment to the reef, if we aren't getting the oysters to spawn and having their spats settle on the reef, and for it to be creating more oysters attaching to each other, building that structure up, then it really isn't going to succeed in the long term. So one of our big monitoring goals for this project is to understand if the reef is self-sustaining. And a key part of this work, you saw all of the partners involved earlier, is that this really is a partnership. And we have community members, we have oyster farmers involved, we have a lot of students involved, and the community engagement and education piece of this work is really key to everything that we're doing. So we do spend a lot of time in the education and outreach arena, and also connecting what we're doing to the larger issues of that we're facing on the coast, and how that connects to water quality and other coastal access issues as well. And then, as we're the first group that's first oyster reef that's trying to be built in Maine, another part of this is really thinking about what are the lessons we're learning, and what are the recommendations we can make for the future. There are a lot of other groups that are interested in oyster reef restoration for various goals across the coast in Maine, and we want to make sure that people aren't making the same mistakes we made or learning from that. And we already had the benefit of having the years that TNC spearheaded this project to learn from, and we've also learned a lot from the years that we've been involved as well. So how are we building the reef? When we first started, we knew that TNC had used the oyster castles or the reef balls to try to create a structure under the water and didn't see a lot of success. So we started looking at what practices are used elsewhere and if we might be able to use them here in Maine. And so the first thing we tried was settling spat on shell. So to do this, we got the tiniest oysters that you can get out of the hatchery, and they're eyed larvae. They just kind of look like coffee grinds, honestly, in a little bag at that point. They're so small. And you can see these barrels up in the top photo here. And we filled them with water, and you have a filter system and flowing water, seawater through here. And you put in recycled oyster shells that have been sat out, dried, cleaned, and then you dump these eyed larvae into the tanks and try to get them to settle. And if this works successfully, what you might see is this bottom photo here, where you can see these small little oysters growing on the shell. What we learned from this process is that it's really finicky and it can be hard to do successfully. There's a lot of things, a lot of places for things to go wrong. If the flowing seawater breaks, or the temperature gets too warm, or the algal feed that you're putting in isn't just right, nothing will settle and nothing will set and nothing will grow, which isn't what you want when you're trying to build a reef. So we tried that and it really didn't work well. And so we went back to the drawing board and thought, what else? What is another way we can get oysters out into this area? And so the second method we tried was growing out small oysters. So we took seed from the hatchery, and just like how a lot of oyster farmers grow out their product, we were growing out juvenile oysters on the farm and had floating cages and got them to a size where they would outsurvive most of the green crab predation, which, as we learned earlier, is definitely a real issue with trying to have oysters survive and grow to adult size out on the reef. And so while this worked fairly well, we could get the oysters to grow. And when they were out on the reef, they were surviving fairly well. It took a lot of time, and it's a lot of labor to run an oyster farm. Ask any oyster farmer. It's not just put the oysters out there and let them go. And we realized that at the end of the day, we weren't trying to be oyster farmers. We really wanted to focus on the reef building efforts. And so this past year, we switched to our third method that we've tried so far. And this was a real collaborative process with local oyster farmers. And there's a lot of oyster farms in the New Meadows River. Most of them are part of the New Meadows River Shellfish Co-op. And we were able to buy oysters from them that they weren't going to be able to sell into the restaurants. And so the idea of purchasing doubles or uglies, so oysters that are too big, or maybe they grew together, they're not nice enough to sell into a raw half shell market for a lot of the restaurant and market demand out there. And the idea of this really started during COVID. TNC had a program that allowed oyster farmers, when all of the restaurants shut down, they lost most of their market, and they had all this product out on the farm that was getting too big and it was taking up space, and they weren't sure what they're going to do with it, and there was a lot of money that they wouldn't be able to get out of it. And TNC started this project, this program SOAR, to buy oysters off of these farms to then use for restoration work. And the great thing about this is it's a benefit to the farmers, and these oysters are already adult size, so they're going to survive predation, and they already have they're already reproducing and contribute a lot to that spawning potential, which is really key if you want that to recruit onto a reef and continue growing. So this past year, we bought over 36,000 oysters from the New Meadows Co-op farms and planted them out on the reef. And so it's only been 6 months or so since those were planted, but that seems to be our most promising method so far. And it'll be interesting to see what the survival and growth looks like that when we go back out and dive underwater next spring. So with all of the work that we're doing to create this oyster reef, we're also very focused on making sure that we're monitoring it to see, is it successful? Is it working? And that's how we knew that in the past, some of those other efforts weren't successful. So we have a lot of different monitoring programs that are happening concurrently out on the reef. And so one of the biggest ones that we're doing, and my favorite one is because it happens underwater, is the substrate mapping and our biodiversity surveys. So to understand if the reef is actually growing, we go down and we dive down and we set out transects and we look at what the bottom type is. And so we did these surveys before any reef was planted at these sites. And then we've gone back multiple times each season to see how that's changing. And in a successful scenario, we're seeing that there's more oyster and shell cover than just a plain shell hash bottom or muddy rocky bottom. And that's the idea that the reef is growing. And then reefs are also a really important biodiversity hotspot in these systems. And so by monitoring if we're seeing more species in these areas, different algae, seaweeds, fish, crabs, other invertebrates, that's another way to gauge success or another metric to look at it and see if more species are coming to this area. So we're also, as we're underwater, looking at all the species that we're seeing down there. And then a key part that I mentioned is, are oysters spawning in this area? And historically in Maine, the waters have been too cold for oysters to spawn. And for this to be successful, we do need that natural spawning and recruitment to happen. So we've been doing two different types of oyster settlement surveys. One of them is that we've been going around the shoreline of the basin. So you can see that map in the bottom corner. The red area is our shoreline survey area. And that's the area that is rocky habitat. This is suitable oyster habitat for the oyster spat to settle out and continue to grow. And so we go out with quad rats and we're looking to see what density of small settled oysters are we seeing on the rocks underneath seaweed. And then we're also using spat collectors on our actual reef site to see if there's any oyster recruitment to the actual reef. And so these are bags of old oyster shells that we put out. And then throughout the entire spawning season over the summer, every 2 weeks we go and we pick up these bags and replace them with a new bag. And we go with a microscope and count any small little oyster larvae that we see. And this also helps us not only understand if the oysters are spawning and settling to this area, but also when is the timing of that, when is that occurring? Because that is really site specific and really depends on a lot of very local environmental factors. And just because it's spawning further up the river at farms weeks earlier doesn't mean that it's happening at the same time in the basin. And this helps us understand when our planting dynamics, when should we plant and put new oysters out on the reef to really help attract some of that settlement. We're also looking at the growth and survival of oysters on the reef. So we have specific subsections of the reef that we have plots at, and we're measuring those oysters over time. We're conducting green crab surveys so that we have a sense of what the predation impacts are at these sites. And these are also green crab surveys that we're doing in other places of the coast. So it gives us a sense of what the density of green crabs is on the reefs. Are the reefs attracting more green crabs to this area? And can get a sense of how that changes over a larger geographic gradient as well. And then we're also monitoring water quality because oysters are filter feeders. Having a reef can improve that water quality. So we are doing, have added some long-term weekly water quality monitoring that's part of a larger protocol that's happening up and down the coast through the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust. And then we also have some autonomous water sensors out there as well that are taking continuous water monitoring data. So I just want to show you a quick video of what it actually looks like on the reef. So this is from one of our sites. If you get dizzy easily, you may want to look away for a few minutes, as I'm not an underwater videographer, so it's a little yeah, we'll take a look. So you can see some of the structure that's here, and then this is our the oysters that we have put out and started to accumulate on the reef. And it looks like just kind of a flat pile at this point, which it is. And over time, the idea is that the reef will build that structure as other oysters recruit and build up. We will start to have a little bit more of a three-dimensional structure that has those benefits to help prevent erosion and recruit more diversity to the reef. Oh, can I? There we go. And so I also want to talk a little bit more about some of the education and outreach work that we're doing, as it is a big part of this project. And so we host a variety of different outreach events for the local community to come and learn about what we're doing in this area. A big piece of this is making sure that there is community support for this work. The Shellfish Committee and the Conservation Committee are really involved in this, and we want the rest of the Phippsburg community to buy into that as well. So we want people to know what's happening out there and really use what the work we're doing to tie into other ideas of what's happening in this coastal ecosystem and what the benefits of it can be. We've also had a lot of college students engaged in this work, and they've contributed some really valuable aspects to this project. We had a Bates student who developed a 5th grade curriculum, and this was both had a in-classroom piece and an experimental piece focused on oysters and filter feeding and the ecosystem benefits of an oyster reef. And so he worked with the local Phippsburg's 5th graders and set up tanks in the classroom and had oysters in there, and you could see the water quality improvements when you put in a bunch of algal feed in a tank without oysters versus a tank that did have oysters. How much just the clarity of the water improved over a short period of time. And then those students came out to this site and had a hands-on experience looking at green crabs and understanding the predation impacts and what this looked like out in the field. We've also worked with other local schools, and it's a really great way to get them out and see what the coast looks like, especially in this area. Even though it's on the coast, some of these students don't necessarily have a great idea of what's happening out on the water. So it's a really great way to connect them to their larger environment. We have a newsletter that goes out a couple times a year, and anyone interested, in a great way to just kind of spread the work that we're doing. And then this fall, we hosted a workshop called Planting the Seed, and this brought together over 30 different participants from all over New England, involved in oyster reef work or oyster farming in some aspect. And we came together in Phippsburg and talked about what reef building looked like in their states or in their organizations, and what some of the challenges and barriers are, and how we might be able to come together and think about ways to facilitate this process over a larger geographic region and take those lessons from a broader scale into the very specific local regions that we're working. And it was also a really great way to build connections and meet other people from areas and projects that are further along than where we are here. Oh, what? I missed the slide here, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about our future work that we're going to expand to. Not sure where that disappeared to. So all the monitoring work that I've already talked about, we're going to continue moving forward. But in exciting news, we recently were funded with a new grant from the Maine Community Foundation that will expand this work onto a larger scale. And so with this new funding, we're going to continue to look at what's happening in the basin, but we're also going to add another site in the Sheepscot River, which is just east of where we've been talking about today. And to understand how those site selection pieces come into play, and are some areas more suitable to this work than others. And then the second big part of this grant is really going to be conducting a socio-ecological study in Maine to identify areas where oyster reefs can be built both on an ecological and environmental standpoint, but also where there's the social desire for this work to happen. And the coast of Maine has a lot of really important work that's happening on the coast. There's a lot of different interests, but there are some of those priorities are conflicting at times. And so there's a lot of other areas where people are interested in building oyster reefs, but some of the other work that's happening may keep oyster reefs from being successful, where oyster farms or wild shellfish harvesting may be more of a priority in that area, and in a way that oyster reefs might compete with that. And so we really want to understand from these factors, where are the areas that we should focus on for successful oyster reef restoration work, both ecologically, but also from a social acceptance point in the local communities. And so we're really excited to continue that work and engage multiple new partners in that as we move forward. And with that, I will wrap up our presentation part of this talk and want to acknowledge our funding sources and our partners that we have been working with on this. It is not just a Manomet effort, and we would not be here without them at all. And then I think we'll open it up to questions.
That sounds great. Jessie and Marissa, thanks so much for that presentation. We do have some questions in the Q&A portion, so let's just get to them. Number one is, what are oyster castles made of?
They're usually concrete. I wasn't sure if Marissa was jumping into that. Yeah, they're a concrete structure.
Okay. I was interested in that as well. And we have a question that says, approximately how far into the future do you expect the waters along the Maine coast to be warm enough to support natural oyster reproduction and reef building?
I think don't necessarily have a time frame of the end date for that, but I think the waters are only getting warmer in Maine, and oysters have a very large thermal tolerance. There's oysters in the Gulf of Mexico, and they're reproducing. So I think the potential for oyster spawning and recruitment is only going to grow from where we're currently at.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think that that's one of the things we hope to answer with some of the work that we're doing. We just don't necessarily, fully understand what's happening in the wild populations in Maine. There are wild oysters that we have, found through surveys, but we don't fully understand, what the sort of environmental factors are and drivers to really be suitable for oyster reproduction. But hopefully through some of this monitoring, we're going to be able to start answering that.
Great. Let's see. We have a question that says, can someone speak briefly to the green crab problem? Length of invasion, how did they arrive, mitigation plans?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll jump in and just say, so green crabs arrived on the east coast of the US in 1817. So they've been here for a very long time. It is not necessarily something we're trying to mitigate anymore. They're here and they're here to stay. And most mitigation efforts for this particular species have failed. So it's more about adaptation and learning to live with them, and finding ways to potentially benefit from the species. As it pertains to shellfish, there are a lot of efforts to try to protect shellfish from green crabs. Some of that work is just what Jessie had talked about, which is, growing shellfish in containment to a size where it has outgrown green crab predation before putting it out into the environment. But I would just also make a plug. We have a couple of archived Manomet webinars, actually, that focus specifically on green crabs. So if there is more interest, I'm pretty sure you can find those on our website.
Thanks, Marissa. Actually, I see someone has raised a hand. Joanne Norton. I don't know if you can unmute yourself and ask the question. Let's see, or put it into the, here she is. Okay. Joanne, you want to ask your question? Unmute yourself if you may.
I didn't have a question, so I don't know what happened.
Okay, that's fine. You can go ahead and mute yourself then again. Sorry, I didn't want to miss anyone to miss out on any burning questions. Actually, okay, here's another one we have. Thank you. Let's see. What is the primary predator of the green crab?
I can jump in there. Everything. Yeah, it's one of those really interesting scenarios where most things will eat green crabs, but it still does not appear to be enough of a biological control to actually control the population. So we see things like fish eating green crabs, ducks. I've actually seen raccoons eating them on the shoreline. People. So, there's a lot of predators. It's just this particular species is incredibly well suited to be an invasive species. They reproduce very rapidly, they grow very quickly, they can reproduce up to 200,000 eggs at a time and potentially more than once a year. So there's just a lot of sort of biological traits of this particular species that allows it to expand so rapidly, despite the fact that there are a lot of predators.
And how do the green crabs interact with the blue crabs that now you're saying?
Good question, Jessie. I'm going to throw that one to you.
That's my own question.
It's a really good question, and we don't necessarily have the answer to it, although there is some work that shows that the blue crabs can outcompete the green crabs. In the Chesapeake, they don't have the same green crab problem that we have here. They have a much larger blue crab population. So that and the blue crabs grow to be much bigger than green crabs as well. And so they have that advantage as well. So that is one hope, that if we see a growing blue crab population continue in Maine, that maybe they will have an impact on the green crabs. They will also likely have other impacts as well that could raise concern, like how blue crabs will interact with lobsters, but that's another conversation.
Okay, great. Let's see, I've got a couple more questions. What are some examples of social situations which would preclude oyster reefs?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and conversation that's happening a lot in Maine right now, of the interaction between wild and farmed shellfish is a hot topic. And oyster reefs kind of fall into that arena as well. There's farmers, oyster farmers, who are concerned that having an oyster reef might bring in disease to the area, or that it might bring in more predators. There's concern from wild shellfish harvesters that an oyster reef would take over the areas where they're harvesting for clams, and oysters would become the dominant species, but they're focused on targeting something different. So there's homeowners who don't want to have that in their backyard as well. So there's a lot of different scenarios where people might be opposed to this. And so it's really just navigating those conversations. And some communities, there's a lot of excitement for it, and others there isn't. And I think that's okay, but it's thinking about what are the areas that we could recommend in the near future where this work could be successful on both the ecological and social side of things.
Great. How about, let's see, other than predators, are you monitoring for new fish species that are using your oyster reefs that were not present prior to creating reefs?
Yeah, so as part of our biodiversity surveys, we're looking at fish while we're underwater and doing our dive work. And so we have we call it a swath survey, and it's just looking in a kind of a cubic box ahead of you as you swim along the transect, and you're identifying any fish species that you see in the area. Fish are hard to capture when you're underwater diving. They will swim away from you. So we are also exploring the possibility of adding in some video monitoring work as well,
nice.
but we are not at that point just yet.
That's great. How about, let's see, what protects the farming oysters from green crabs, or are farms also affected?
Yeah, so a lot of oyster farms will grow out their oysters in either floating cages or floating bags, or in protected bags or nets on the bottom if it's more of an intertidal environment. So there are some farms that just bottom plant. By the time they will put the oysters on the bottom, if they're unprotected, they will wait till they're a size where they can survive most of that green crab predation. So they're big enough and the green crabs can't eat them. But the majority of oyster farming, especially in Maine, there's different techniques used elsewhere, is in floating gear in cages or bags.
Okay, great. And I've got one last question here. And then I have a last question as well. Do you foresee a time when established oyster reefs can be left alone, or will annual reseeding be required in perpetuity?
I'll take a stab, Marissa, feel free to jump in as well. The hope is that if this is to be successful, then the hope is that they would be able to be left alone without annual reseeding, and that recruitment would be enough to sustain the reef alone. I'm not sure what that timeline would look like, or if we're even there yet in Maine, and that's one of the questions that we do hope to answer. Whether it's yes or no, honestly, that is a big focus of this work, and that will help suggest to other groups who are interested in and give them a better sense of what is really feasible in Maine at this point with the current conditions we have.
That's great. So I'd like to close it out with a question, which is, did you know how to scuba dive before you took this job, or was that on the job training?
No, I've been diving. I was diving for a while, and that's partly how I maybe got this job, because Marissa and I first met each other doing totally unrelated work, but it was scuba based surveys while I was in a different position, and so that's how I first heard about Manats. So in some ways that led me here, but I've been diving for a while.
She poached you underwater.
I did. I definitely did. And any excuse we have to get in the water is always a good one. So
That's great. All right, that'll do it for our questions. I just want to say thank you both so much. I learned a lot. That was a great presentation. And I just want to say thanks to all the attendees. Thanks for being here. And we want to welcome you. We're going to have another small sit seminar webinar next month. It's going to be on our Amazon workshop. The exact date is TBD. We're working out some travel schedules with our scientists. But if you'd like to learn more about Manomet, please visit our website, manomet.org, or join the conversation on our Facebook or Instagram pages. And if you enjoyed today, we'd love to have you support our work directly with donation online if you haven't already. And again, thank you, Marissa and Jessie, and all of our attendees. We at the Small Sit are signing off, and we wish you a happy and healthy new year. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.